Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. Shavua Tov, a good week to you. In Yiddish, a good vach. And it is a good week already because we're starting strong by learning on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us? Whoa. Light the wick. Light up the darkness. Who's going to be with us as we do a little learning to start our week? We got James Roth in Indianapolis, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck. Harold Black says Shavua Tov. Chaim with us from Charlotte, Nancy from North Carolina, Mark from Portland. Oregon, that is. Lori from New Mexico. Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire. Angie says Shavua Tov from Columbus, Ohio. Alex from Dominical, Costa Rica. Bienvenido, Alex. Rodriguez Dorca says hello from Puerto Rico. Welcome. Maria from Cincinnati. Kathy from Sacramento. Gail is with us. Yelena from Bend, Oregon. Julie Nail says shalom. Yelena is with us from Bend, Oregon. Gail from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Yehudet from Florence, South Carolina. Lindsay with us from Cincinnati. Shirley from Alabama. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Soklane Saphir is asking what it is. Stick with us and you'll find out. Mark with us. Oh, there was another riot in Portland. Sorry to hear it. Paula from Louisiana. And Stanley from Ohio. Wow, a lot of people. Kathleen saying hi. Marion from Long Island, New York. Rhonda from Center, Texas. And Reza Aguila dice hola desde Manhattan. And Kathleen says it's a beautiful night. And that's right, it is a beautiful night. We had a Rosh Chodesh this past week. So tonight, after the final davening of Saturday, right, as we moved out of Shabbos, right, we had Mincha, the afternoon service of Shabbos, then the evening service when we're back in the week. So it's a regular weekday service, except we have additions for Saturday night, where we thank God for giving us the wisdom and knowledge and understanding to distinguish between day and night, sacred and secular, etc. And then we stepped outside and made Kiddush Levana, where we bless God and thanking Him for renewing the moon. And spiritually, metaphorically, we think about that just as the moon is renewed every month, we are renewed. We have personal cycles of renewal. We have national cycles of renewal. We have historical, epical cycles of renewal. And whenever things look dark, we can count on God to pull us through and back into the light. Over there, on the YouTube side, we have Lindsay from Texas asking, what is a windlass? I think that's a nautical term, something that is used on a ship. I'm not sure why you're asking, but I suspect it may have something to do with drawing water, which we're going to be talking. It's going to be fascinating. We have a really interesting page tonight. We are near the very end of Tractate Eruvin. We're on Daf Kuf Dalet. That's page 104 out of 105 pages here in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. The second volume was Shabbos, which was about 150 pages, so another 105 pages, and that's bringing us to the end, not of everything we'll talk about Shabbos in the Talmud, but of the formal study of the laws of Shabbos. We're going to be finishing with God's help tomorrow night. We'll be making a siyum, a completion ceremony and celebration. The regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. As we finish Tractate Eruvin, we're going to say some beautiful blessings that are traditionally said when one completes a volume of study. And then we'll read the first few lines of our next volume, because as soon as we finish one course of study, we want to start another. And we'll move into Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. Tonight, we're going to have a very interesting journey. We've been talking about the differences. Here, we're in chapter 10 of Tractate Eruvin. This has the highest number of Mishnas in it, and it's almost like a bunch of extra additional thoughts and laws that the sages want to give to us before we leave this study of Shabbos. And these last 5 Mishnas all have in common this feature of there are rabbinic decrees that the rabbis issued to protect us from coming to violate Torah prohibitions with respect to Shabbos and to enhance the beauty and holiness of Shabbos. But some of those decrees do not apply on the grounds of the Holy Temple itself when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. The first temple stood for 400 years. It was destroyed. Then the second temple stood for 400 years, a little bit more. And then it was destroyed about 2,000 years ago. And we've been without the Holy Temple in Jerusalem for about 2,000 years. But our prayer, our daily prayer, is that Mashiach will come, the Messiah will come, the Messianic age will begin, and the temple will be restored. The third temple will be erected immediately when the Messianic age comes. And then so many of these laws and mitzvahs, which are only possible to fulfill when the temple is standing, we would then start fulfilling. Nevertheless, even though the temple hasn't stood for 2,000 years, we study the laws of the offerings and so many other laws that are involved in the maintenance, construction, and all kinds of services and features and observances that are only possible in the temple. We continue to study them as if the temple is standing. And in today's journey, we're going to have two Mishnahs, which again have this distinction between laws outside the temple and inside the temple. And as we'll see in the second Mishnah, we're going to be talking about sounds that are produced in the temple. And that is going to lead to our discussion of musical instruments on Shabbos. Recall that just yesterday we were talking about a law that was distinction between in the temple and out on if the string of a harp breaks on Shabbos. So in the temple, it can be repaired, but outside the temple, it can't. And there seemed to be an implication that musical instruments were played on Shabbos, perhaps outside the temple. They just couldn't be repaired. As we'll see today, that may have existed at some point, but even by the time of the Talmud, certainly it was already been decreed that no musical instruments could be played on Shabbos. The question is why, and how far does that decree go? Is it just stringed instruments that can't be played because you might come to repair a string and make a permanent knot, which is something that is prohibited to do on Shabbos? Is there a different labor involved that we're concerned about if we play an instrument on Shabbos? And what about other kinds of devices that make a sound but are not necessarily a musical instrument? Is the prohibition on musical instruments going to extend even to those kinds of devices? We'll be discussing that in Mishnah 18. However, first we're going to do a quick discussion of the short Mishnah number 17 here in chapter 10 of Tractate Eruvin. So let's read the Mishnah. Mishnah 17 here in chapter 10. With regard to a priest who was injured on his finger on Shabbos, he may temporarily wrap it with a reed so that his wound is not visible while he is serving in the temple. This leniency applies in the temple but not in the country, as it also heals the wound, and medical treatment is prohibited on Shabbos due to a rabbinic decree. If his intention is to draw blood from the wound or to absorb blood, it is prohibited both in the temple and outside the temple. So recall, the rabbis decreed against applying a new bandage on Shabbos. As always, whenever we're talking about first aid or medical procedures or treatments or any kind of medication on Shabbos, remember that if any kind of life-saving situation, these rules go out the window. We desecrate Shabbos. We do anything we need to do to save life. But when we're talking about a minor wound, as we saw, the rabbis were concerned that if you apply a new bandage on Shabbos or you take off and replace a bandage on Shabbos, what might happen is that you would come to spread an ointment on the skin. And this is actually prohibited labor. Smoothing is part of the process of tanning a hide, taking an animal hide and turning it into leather that can be used for various things, including there were animal hides that were part of the covering of the tabernacle when the children of Israel were in the desert. And that tabernacle actually served as the temple for the first 400 years that the children of Israel were living in the land of Israel. So one of the steps in taking an animal hide and turning it into leather is that you have to, take off all the hair, and then you really scrape it down so that, all of the hair is gone, and so you smooth the leather. And when you rub ointment onto a person's skin, that is tantamount to smoothing, and that's why we don't apply ointment or cream or even creamy sunblock on Shabbos, and likewise we don't change bandages. So here they're saying there's going to be a special exception for the priests in the temple. They're not going to be allowed to apply a bandage, maybe. We're going to talk about that in the Gemara in a second. But the first discussion is about a reed. So imagine like a kind of straw, like dry grass, a dry reed, right? That's already, you can't cut a reed from the ground, but if it's already been cut, they're saying, and he gets a cut on his hand, he could wrap it in a reed just so that he can perform his service. Remember that the priests do work on Shabbos in the sense that they are fulfilling their obligations. They are performing mitzvahs, commandments, in the Holy Temple. Even on Shabbos, there are offerings that are brought on Shabbos. It's a Torah commandment that there are certain Shabbos offerings that are brought every week. There's the daily offering and the additional offering of Shabbos, the Musaf offering. And for the priest to be able to do that, we talked about yesterday that they could even take a wart off their hand that would disqualify them from performing that service, that avodah, the work of worship for a priest, a Kohen. And if he's got a small cut, he could just wrap that in a reed so that he can continue to perform the service. But as the Mishna itself is saying, if he puts that reed on, there's actually some medicinal property of using straw on a wound because it can kind of draw the blood out a little bit. It can absorb some of the blood. It has some curative property. You can't do it for that. You're really just, the priest, and only a priest could do this outside the temple. Regular people can't. But the priest could only use the reed just to enable him to perform the service, not to try to do, some kind of extended first aid. Okay, so here we go. We get into the Gemara, and Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says only a reed is permitted, a small sash, no. So now that the Mishnah has said we can use a piece of straw for this. So then the question is, well, can we use a small cloth for the same reason, right? We're not creating a bandage, but we're just going to put a little bit of cloth on that cut so that the priest can continue to do his service in the Holy Temple. Now, the word that's used here is a sash, a small sash. So what is a sash? It seems to be fancy cloth, as opposed to just any kind of cloth, right? So a sash has this property of being some kind of proper fancy cloth, maybe the kind of cloth which is used in the priestly garments. Maybe, because after the priestly garments had worn out, they were actually kept in the temple and were actually cut up and used for the wicks in the menorah. So maybe there was some of that available. It's particular cloth. It's already been used in the holy service. So maybe a sash could be used. But Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Chia, only a reed is permitted, a small sash, no. Why? So this sash, right, which came perhaps from the holy garments, or maybe it's just fancy cloth from somewhere else, why does Rabbi Chia say no? Well, because it's no longer part of the actual priestly garments, and the Torah was very specific. The priests wore exactly 4 garments. It was like that covered their body, and there was a special sash around the belt, and some other parts to it. And then the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had an additional 4 garments, so he wore 8 garments. And those were the specific garments that God said in the Torah that the priests will wear when they're serving in the temple. So says Rabbi Chia, If you add this other little sash because of your cut, what you've actually done is added a fifth garment for the priest or a ninth garment for the high priest, and now he's not wearing what he was supposed to wear by Torah law. No extra garments for a priest beyond what the Torah specifies in the priestly garments. Rabbi Yochanan says, well, an extra garment is prohibited only in the place where garments are worn, where the priestly garments are worn, right? So now the issue is not so much that he would have an additional garment, because this isn't an additional garment. It's just a little piece of cloth being put on a cut. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, if he has the cut under where the priestly garments are on him, okay, then you can't do it because this additional little piece of cloth would form an interposition between him and the priestly garments. But in a place where the garments are not worn, okay, so then he could have a little piece of cloth. On the other hand, the Gemara is going to note right away that, it could be on the left hand, but if this piece of cloth was on the right hand, where he actually is carrying the holy vessels that are part of his work in the temple, and that piece of cloth that's on his cut would interpose between him and the holy vessels that he's carrying, that would be a prohibited interposition. But, says the Gemara, okay, but if it's on the left hand where it's not going to interpose, or it's on the right hand in a place where it's not going to interpose, then it should be permitted, right? That's the idea we're getting at now. Then it should be permitted. So Rava says, in the name of Rav Chisda, that where the Kohanic garments, where the priestly garments are worn, even one thread interposes, right? So even a thread. So it doesn't matter how small this little piece of cloth that you're going to put on the cut that the priest got, doesn't matter how small it is, if it comes between him and his priestly garments, no good. You can't have anything between him and the Torah mandated priestly garments. Okay. But if it's elsewhere, not where his garments are touching his body, but if it was on his neck or on his hand or somewhere that's exposed anyway, then according to Rav in the name of Rav Chisda, that a cloth, as long as it's less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, right? So something about that size, like a square about 3 finger breadths wide, that's going to be okay. We'll see elsewhere in Talmudic law that a piece of cloth which is less than 3 by 3 finger breadths is not considered significant. It's as if there's no cloth at all there. And so that would be okay, as long as it doesn't interpose between the priest's skin and the holy garments or the holy vessels that he is carrying. And where the halacha, the law comes out on this, is just like this. So no additional garments. A priest cannot add to his garments. If he has a cut, he could put, this reed or even a very small piece of cloth, less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, as long as it doesn't interpose between him and his garments or between him and the vessels that he's using to perform the holy service in the temple. However, in terms of a sash, which maybe it's made from a holy garment or it's just some kind of fancy cloth as opposed to just some random piece of cloth, even if it's less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, it's still considered significant and therefore it is prohibited. The priest may not use a sash, no matter how small and no matter what location on the body, as a little bandage just to keep the blood off the vessels of the holy service. That's our discussion of Mishna 17. If you have questions on that, put that in the comments. I'm going to be coming back around to it after a discussion of Mishna 18. Let me get a drink of water. Okay. Before drinking water, I said the blessing over water. Okay. Mishnah 18, let us read it, and this is what's going to lead to our discussion of the question in the title of tonight's show: are we permitted to play any kind of musical instruments on Shabbos? The little emoji that I used was a drum. because people might think, well, drums, you're not going to come to fix a drum. It's such a sturdy musical instrument. It's so similar to banging on tables, which seems to be permitted, but is it permitted? So some people think drums are okay on Shabbos. Now let's find out where we're going to come out on musical instruments, and we're going to get to it by way of a Mishnah that doesn't seem to be at all about musical instruments. Let's see how we're going to make this connection, how the Talmud is going to make this connection. Mishnah 18, here in chapter 10 of Tractate Eruvin. One may scatter salt on Shabbos on the ramp that leads to the altar so that the priests will not slip on their way up. And likewise, one may draw water from the cistern of the exiles and from the great cistern, which were located in the temple, by means of the wheel designed for drawing water, even on Shabbos. And one may draw water from the Hecker well only on a festival. Okay, so it seems to be, about physical movement in the temple and what's possible. First, we'll do our discussion of this salt on the ramp. Now, I grew up in New York State, and I remember very well in the winters when it snowed, out would come those trucks on the New York State Thruway. I'm sure anybody who lives in the northern United States is familiar with salt being used to make a surface less slippery if there's going to be snow on it. Does it snow in Jerusalem? Yeah, it snows in Jerusalem. I haven't personally been there when it was snowing, but there's so many beautiful videos that you can see from time to time. It definitely snows in Jerusalem. Sometimes it snows quite hard. The Holy Temple, the Solomon's Temple and later the Second Temple, was made out of stone. I mean, just all the surfaces were made out of very smooth stone. Even in rain, that could become dangerous, but particularly when there was snow, the priest could really be in trouble, particularly on that ramp that led up to the altar where the offerings are brought. It could become quite dangerous because they're walking up a very steep ramp carrying animals that are going to be offered on the altar or wood for the pyre on the altar. So it's a nice thing that, hey, the priests shouldn't, break their necks, God forbid, as they're walking up the ramp to the altar. So the question is, may we use salt to save them from slipping? So the first question is, well, what's the problem? Why couldn't we put some salt on the ground on Shabbos so that the priests don't slip on the altar? And there's going to be two issues, as we'll see. One issue is when you're adding something to the ground and it's your intent to just leave it on the ground, that could be perceived as building up the ground, right? Building up the surface of the ground that you're walking on. Even that ramp on the altar, you're going to put salt on it and leave it there. And over time, maybe that surface is going to rise a little bit. And then that could be the prohibited labor of construction on Shabbos, right? Adding dirt, filling in holes, any kind of building up the ground is prohibited to do on Shabbos. Alternatively, the issue might be that since the priest is commanded in the Torah to walk up the altar to put those offerings, walk up the ramp to put those offerings on the altar, then if there's some substance on that ramp that's unnatural, the salt that might be added, perhaps it would be an interposition between the priest's feet and the portion of the temple in which he's serving. That's what's at stake here. Let's see what the Gemara is going to say. I'm actually going to read the first paragraph of the Gemara. Rav, his name is Ika, from Pashronya, raised a contradiction before Rava. We learned in the Mishnah, one may scatter salt on Shabbos on the ramp that leads to the altar, so that the priests will not slip, from which it can be inferred in the temple. Yes, it is permitted to do so, but outside the temple and the rest of the country, no, it is prohibited to scatter salt on a ramp. And he raised a contradiction from a Baraisa with regard to a courtyard that was damaged on Shabbos by rainwater. So imagine courtyards were usually made out of dirt. Let's say it rained really hard, and now, the yard outside the houses that share that courtyard is full of mud. It's very, very unpleasant. What would people do? They would spread straw, right? A bunch of straw. They would just scatter the straw on the mud, and that would make it much easier to walk from one house to another through this muddy courtyard. So with regard to a courtyard that was damaged on Shabbos by rainwater so that it became difficult to cross, one may bring straw and scatter it about to absorb the water. Apparently, an action of this kind is permitted even outside the temple, right? So we're saying, well, if it's permitted to put salt on the ramp up to the altar, and that's what the Mishna says in the temple, okay, so seems like you can add a substance because of the weather conditions to the ramp of the altar, but not outside the temple. And yet here we have a baraisa that says when the courtyard is muddy because of Shabbos, you can put some straw on it. So the Gemara says, no, this is not a contradiction. It doesn't say la kasha. This is not difficult. It could. But it says this is not a contradiction. Why? Because when you put straw on that muddy ground, your intent is not to leave the straw there. It's not like over time in these courtyards from the different days that it has rained over the years, every time they throw straw out there, and over the years the level of the courtyard because of this addition of straw keeps rising. Rather, after the weather gets better again and it dries up, they collect the straw which has absorbed the water and get rid of it. So they don't leave the straw on the ground. In other words, one does not negate it. One does not think of the straw as something that you're going to spread out and leave it there and then it becomes negated. Rather, one is going to gather it up after it absorbs the water and move it somewhere else. What about the salt on the ramp? Are they planning on, collecting that later because they're not negating it? They're not going to leave it there? Rav Acha, the son of Rava, explains if one negates the salt on the ramp, not only is he, leaving it there and possibly being engaged in building, construction, sort of building up the ground level, but if you do that in the temple, there's an additional issue. You're adding to the temple, right? So the temple was sort of given to I guess King Solomon through prophecy exactly how that temple should be built. It was specified. The second temple was built based on the first temple and the prophecies of Ezekiel. In both cases, it was revealed through divine insight from God what the temple should look like and be built like, and what its specifications and measurements would be like. You can't add to the temple. At times there were, when Herod made a big construction project, who knows if he did how he did that. But when they added to the temple, they certainly didn't do it lightly, right? There was actually a ceremony for any kind of a change that was made to the temple, and they were very careful that it would conform to the holy requirements of the temple. So there's a concern here. If you're just throwing salt on the altar to the ramp, first you might be doing prohibited construction on Shabbos, and second, you might be doing prohibited construction in terms of adding to the specifications of the temple. And if he does not negate it, if he's not thinking that the salt is just going to be tossed there, it'll be anti-slip for the priests, but then later we're going to sweep it away, then there's a substance that we're planning to remove later, which is going to interpose between the feet of the priest and the altar itself, the ramp of the altar. And so there's something coming between the priest and performing the holy service as it is meant to be performed. So we really have a problem. How is this salt going to be permitted? Whether one negates it and leaves it there, which adds to the temple and might be construction, or whether one does not negate it, then it might be an interposition. Either way, we have a problem. Okay. So the Gemara says, he does not negate the salt. He does not leave it there. It's not going to build up over time. He's not going to be engaged in prohibited construction, and he's not going to change, even on a near microscopic level, the dimensions of the temple and particularly the ramp. Rather, he doesn't negate it. It's just helping the priest not to slip, and they're only going to apply it in the morning. Why? Because the first time that the priest walks up the ramp in the morning, he's not going there to perform the holy service. He's not bringing an animal to be burned on the altar, or even the limbs, sort of a particular sort of extra part of some offerings that get burned there, which is part of the holy service. Rather, the first time the priests walk up the ramp in the morning, it's to build the fire that the offerings are going to be consumed in on the altar. So when he's bringing the wood up the ramp to build on the pyre, that's going to be the fire up on the altar, that's considered not the holy service, but rather preparation for the holy service. And as we've seen, there's a distinction between preparation for a mitzvah and the mitzvah itself. Building the fire is just preparation for the mitzvah. So there, we're not worried about the problem of interposition. And the sages were able to find, they needed a good legal method for making sure that the priests don't slip in the morning. Now you could ask, okay, but if it's snowing all day, that's not going to help them later. But that's the way salt works, right? You could put the salt there in the morning. I guess it's an interposition. It's not an interposition. It is an interposition. It doesn't matter that it's an interposition when they're just walking up the trees, the wood for the fire in the morning. I don't think they swept it away. I think it was like it was just kind of ground down, and they just didn't worry about it for the rest of the day. But the point is, they only spread the salt in the morning to protect the priests from slipping before they brought the wood up for the pyre on the altar. Rava comments, in the courtyard that's damaged by rainwater, we scatter straw. We said that seemed to be a contradiction. But Rav Papa says, you should note, now that we're talking about spreading straw in the courtyard because it got rainy and it's muddy and gross and we want to be able to cross the courtyard, yes, we spread straw, but we don't do it in the typical fashion, not in a small basket or in a large basket. Rather, we use the bottom of a broken basket. So it's going to be atypical scattering, so that even if we're doing something that, smells or feels vaguely like a prohibited labor, we're going to do it differently on Shabbos to acknowledge we're doing it on Shabbos. Now, so Rava said, in a courtyard damaged by rainwater, we scatter straw. That's all he said. Rav Papa said, we scatter straw, but we do it not with a small basket or a large basket, just the bottom of a broken basket. So Rava said, oh, you're right. And I already issued this ruling that we scatter straw in a courtyard, a rainy courtyard on Shabbos. And I didn't add the missing part about using a broken basket to scatter the straw. So we're not doing it like the rest of the week. I made a mistake. What did Rava do? He hired an Amora, so an important rabbi, not quite at the level of Rava, but an important rabbi, a sage in Bavel, in Babylonia, to help him go out in the area and proclaim to the people, I, Rava, made a mistake, and I said you can scatter straw in a rainy courtyard on Shabbos. I should have added, and if you do that, you must use a broken basket to scatter the straw. You can't do it with a regular basket, like you would walk around with a basket and spread straw. You can't do that. You have to do it unlike the way you would do it during the week. That's a real lesson in leadership, right? You make a mistake, you not only apologize for your mistake, but you make sure that everybody knows you made a mistake so they don't accidentally come to rely on your mistaken ruling. Very good by Rava. Turned out the people already knew. They knew that ruling in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, so it almost wasn't necessary for him to issue the retraction. But I think that he wanted to make sure that people didn't think that he had somehow overruled Rabbi Eliezer's ruling that you can spread straw in a rainy courtyard, but you must use the broken basket. And Rava made sure everyone knew that he had made a mistake. Okay, now we're finally coming to musical instruments. Now the Mishna was spreading salt on the ramp to the altar, and that we may draw water from the cistern of the exiles and from the great cistern, which are both located in the temple, by means of the wheel designed for drawing water, even on Shabbos. So the Gemara now, the Talmud quotes that part of the Mishnah and says, let me just, it's such a weird juxtaposition. Here it says, we learn in the Mishnah, what I just said, one may draw water from the cistern of the exiles by means of a wheel. The Gemara relates, Ula happened to come to the house of Rav Menashe when a certain man came and knocked at the door. Ula said, who is that? May his body be desecrated as he desecrates Shabbos by producing a sound. So according to Ula, this man who was knocking on the door was desecrating Shabbos by knocking on a door. And the Talmud is introducing this incident right after quoting the Mishnah, which says that they could draw water with a wheel in the temple. So the implication is, in the temple you could draw water with a wheel, but outside the temple you couldn't. Why? Because as opposed to, just putting a bucket in a well and lifting out some water, which we've talked about many times, when you use a wheel, it's going to be creaking and making all kinds of noise. And so Ula is suggesting that the sages ruled, at least Ula was the sage who would go back and forth between Eretz Yisrael, the Holy Land, and the Jewish community in Babylonia. And he would bring teachings back and forth between the sages in those two important communities of Torah study. And he was saying that in Israel, it's considered a big deal that you don't make noise, at least unnecessary noise, on Shabbos. Where did that come from? Ultimately, what was being said over there is that we don't make any kind of musical noise lest we come to repair a musical instrument. And the sages in Israel were actually taking that ruling very far. Right? Over there in Babylonia, they didn't think about it obviously you can knock on a door. That's not musical in any way. A door is not a musical instrument. But the sages in Israel had started to take that ruling very far indeed. And now we're going to explore how far it went and then how it became limited. And so more things were allowed. So let's see how it worked out. Okay. So Rabbah said, and by the way, Ula, we see many stories around in the Talmud, he's very emotional, very stark. He's very stern, very stringent. It was pretty extreme of him to say he doesn't even know who's out there, why he's knocking, and says, may his body be desecrated the way he desecrates Shabbos. It's very extreme. And I think Rav Menashe was actually uncomfortable with it. Okay, so Rabbah says, all right, the sages did not prohibit knocking on a door. The sages prohibited musical sounds. Now, musical sounds don't only come from musical instruments. So even Rabbah in Babylonia is saying, okay, but they did prohibit musical sounds. So that's going to include rhythmically banging on a table on Shabbos, and clapping on Shabbos, tap dancing on Shabbos, anything that's going to produce that rhythmic musical sound, according to this, is going to be prohibited on Shabbos. Now, when I read that, I'm like, whoa, because I daven, I pray with congregations that are very musical. They don't use musical instruments. They're Orthodox, Jewish communities. We don't use musical instruments in the synagogue on Shabbos. But we're certainly clapping. I mean, singing is permitted according to all opinions. It says that singing always permitted. But clapping and banging on tables for sure, I've been a part of in very Haredi communities, ultra-Orthodox communities. So what's going on? How did this come about? So let's go on. So Abaye says, okay, Rabbah said the sages prohibited only musical sound. Abaye is going to say, well, actually, they prohibited more than that, not just musical sound. They did prohibit noise, like sound makers, things that produce a sound on purpose. That's their purpose. So Abaye says, for instance, we may drip water from a vessel only for an ill person. Now, this is described on our page. There was a device, it was very interesting. It's some kind of, almost like a shower head, you can imagine. And there would be water that would drip out of it onto some kind of a surface. And I think anybody who's heard, the pitter-patter of raindrops at night as they're falling asleep, it's a soothing sound. And so there was a device that would help an ill person fall asleep by kind of dripping water onto some kind of a surface that would, intended to make that sound from the device that's dripping the water. And so it was considered, something that was medicinal, therapeutic for somebody who's ill and having trouble falling asleep. So Abai is saying, right, they permitted that for a person who's ill on Shabbos, but not for the average person. So they're prohibiting some kind of a noise maker, a sound maker for average people. Abai says also we have a teaching that we may not clap or stomp our feet to drive away animals who might be, descent like a farmer, and birds or other animals are going to come and eat, his pumpkins or gourds, and he's not allowed to go clap and stomp his feet to drive away the animals. So the Gemara right away comments, okay, that's not because they were prohibiting musical sounds. They prohibited the clapping and stomping because he might then come to pick up a rock from the ground, a pebble, and throw it at the animals to scare them away. And as we've seen before, stones, sticks, twigs, dirt, anything that's on the ground is considered muktzah, set aside, has no permitted use on Shabbos, so we don't touch it. You shouldn't be picking up a stone to scare away an animal on Shabbos. So the sages prohibited clapping and stomping so that you won't come to be touching the stones and throw it at the animal, which might be muktzah. That's problematic because muktzah is a rabbinic decree, and we don't want to make a rabbinic decree on a rabbinic decree, but rather it might be that when you go and throw the stone at the animal, you might come to transfer the stone from one domain to another, and then you'd be violating a Torah prohibition. At any rate, we're still a little uncertain about clapping and stomping. So Rav, we saw that. So Rav Yehuda brings down a teaching in the name of Rav that there was a game that apparently women like to play. It was sort of like marbles, like where they would use nuts. It was some kind of a game where they were rolling nuts around on the ground, and they would strike each other. I mean, it just sounds a lot like some kind of game of marbles, but using nuts. But it was definitely making a sound, that clinking sound when the nuts would hit each other. And so suggests Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav that the reason that the sages prohibited that game on Shabbos is because of the sound. It was a sound-making game. Says the Gemara, no, the reason they prohibited that game is because the women who played it might come to level the ground so they would have a better surface to roll the nuts around on. And leveling the ground is definitely a prohibited labor on Shabbos. It's part of construction, right? Smoothing the ground is part of the work of construction. So that's why they prohibit it, not on account of the sound. The Gemara says, well, the Mishna the Mishna allowed water to be drawn from these two cisterns in the temple using a water wheel. In the temple, yes. Outside the temple, no. Presumably because using a wheel would create all this noise. And that's why they prohibited. Answers the Gemara to its own question. No, that's not why they prohibited drawing water with a wheel. The reason they prohibited drawing water with a wheel is that that's a way to draw up a lot of water, and a person might come to water his garden. And now he's engaged in the prohibited labor on Shabbos of farming, right? Of watering his garden. It's like watering his crops. We certainly don't do that on Shabbos. And that's why the water wheel is prohibited outside the temple, not because of the noise. A Meimar permitted water drawing via a wheel in the city of Mechoza because there were no gardens in Mechoza. There was no farm fields and no gardens. It was like a very densely packed city, and there was no concern that people were going to use water, drawing water with a water wheel. I mean, using a wheel to draw up lots of buckets of water from a well in Mechoza, there was no concern that they were going to water their gardens. However, when a Meimar saw that people were soaking flax in barrels of water on Shabbos, he rescinded that lenient ruling and said, that's it, no drawing water with a wheel on Shabbos. So we're still left wondering, oh, wait a minute. So when did it become prohibited to use all instruments? That seems to be for sure. right? You can't use any instruments on Shabbos, and the concern is that you might come to repair the instrument, right? In the case of a stringed instrument, the concern is that you will tie a knot, which is a permanent knot, which is not just for Shabbos, like a temporary knot, like a bow, which was permitted by some opinions, but a permanent knot is something you can't tie on Shabbos, and you might come to repair a musical instrument, a stringed instrument, and make a permanent knot. But what if it's an instrument without strings? What's the issue then? If the instrument broke in some way and you repair it, now you basically made a working instrument. It's like you finished production of the instrument once again. It was a finished instrument, then it broke. It was an unusable instrument, then you repaired it. What is the prohibited labor? Striking the final blow. You took something that was not a usable working instrument, turned it into a usable working instrument. That's striking the final blow. So so you can't repair musical instruments lest you strike the final blow on Shabbos. And that's why no musical instruments permitted to be used on Shabbos, not at home, not in synagogue, not anywhere. In the temple, yes, because the Levites are fulfilling a commandment of creating music even on Shabbos in the temple. But outside the temple, no musical instruments. But now we've seen that it seems that the sages went further, and lest one come to use musical instruments and repair a musical instrument, it seems like they also prohibited that people should make musical noise like clapping or banging on a table. But we know we do that today. So how did it change? What is the law? So here I went to Kitzer Shulchan Aruch to understand a little bit what's going on. So see how the law changed over time. First, here's the law. Repairing a musical instrument is prohibited because of the malacha, the work of striking the final blow. Kitzer discusses decrees enacted to protect against transgression of this prohibition. It is prohibited to make heard, i.e. to produce a musical sound on Shabbos, either with an instrument or with one's limbs or other parts of the body, except for making musical sounds with one's mouth, which is permitted. So you can sing for sure, but it seems like clapping and stomping or banging on a table, prohibited. This means it is prohibited even to snap one's fingers against each other, or to tap them on a tablet to produce sound, or rattle with a nut or a bell for an infant in order that he should not cry. And furthermore, one may neither clap one's hands nor dance. However, in honor of the Torah, such as on the festival of Simchas Torah, it is permitted to clap and dance. Also, upon seeing one who does this, claps or dances for an infant in order that he should not cry, one should not object, since there are those who permit it in any case. And then in the footnote, we come to a ruling of the Rama. The Rama cites an opinion that since nowadays we are not proficient in repairing musical instruments, the decree against making musical sounds no longer applies. Based on this opinion, it became common in some places, to be lenient with respect to clapping and dancing, although the playing of actual musical instruments is clearly prohibited. Since there is a lenient opinion regarding clapping and dancing, Kitzer rules that one should not object to someone who claps or dances for the sake of calming an infant. See Mishna Berura, who states that it is not proper to rely on the lenient view and permit clapping or dancing, but this practice may be tolerated when done for the sake of a mitzvah. So, clapping and dancing and stomping and banging on a table rhythmically, which would otherwise be prohibited because we might come to use musical instruments and then to repair a musical instrument, is permitted in synagogue because it's for the purpose of honoring the Torah. and honoring God by honoring God's Torah, right? So it is permitted in synagogue to clap, dance, stomp, and bang on the tables. Probably permitted, unclear, but probably permitted, like at your table, at your Shabbos table, because many times I've been at a Shabbos table where people are singing and they end up banging on the table. But again, what are they singing? They're singing songs, based on scripture. The kind of songs that we sing on Shabbos are all prayers. We might be very raucous and rowdy and spirited in the way that we sing them, but we're not singing, other kinds of like rock and roll songs. We're singing songs that are based on scripture. So when we're honoring Torah, okay, there's a leniency in effect, just like we would at Simchas Torah, which is a big raucous celebration with a lot of singing, dancing, clapping, etc. Seems like it's okay in synagogue when we're honoring Torah or when we're honoring Torah, but otherwise prohibited on Shabbos. That's what we've learned today. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. Let us check comments and questions. It's not Shabbos. I can bang on my desk. Okay. Let's see. Only one question so far. Maybe a few more will come in. Mark Lister says, we have similar rules in terms of Catholic faith regarding the priestly garments. I guess that there's no interposition between the priest and the garments. Mark says that generally in Catholicism, a man... Well, hold on a second. Google just signed me out of the document I use to communicate with Nina when she gives me the questions that I can answer. He says, generally in Catholicism, a man with a certain wound cannot give communion. So the same idea of a priest can be disqualified from the Holy Service.
Did you see all the comments?
Now I've got them. Yeah, it just rebooted. Okay. Yosef says, Alon More in Shomron is freezing, but it's beautiful half the time. I think must be responding to what I said about that it snows in Jerusalem. Lynn in Texas says, with regard to her mentioning a windlass, that in the Talmud Bavli in the Art Scroll edition, in the English translation, there's much discussion about using a windlass to draw water and whether or not it made a noise, right? So here in the Koran, they're translating it as drawing water with a wheel. I guess in the Art Scroll, they're calling it a windlass. But I think what we're basically talking about is a pulley, right? So it's basically a wheel, and the rope goes over the wheel. Pull on the rope, so now you're pulling down while the rope is lifting the bucket up. Right? It's also giving us a bit of a gear if they've used two wheels like that. But the point is that using that kind of a wheel makes noise. And there was a question, is that why it's forbidden? Because of the noise. And as we learned, it's not the noise of the wheel that made it prohibited outside the temple, but the fact that people might come to use, this large capacity water drawing to come to water their gardens, which would be prohibited on Shabbos. Bill says, Herod achieved his construction capital form of all things, accurately playing the real politic of Rome after Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was heavily bribed by both Mark Antony and Octavian for his loyalty in their civil war. Not the most honorable way to raise capital, but hey, it worked. So Bill is commenting on the fact that Herod was able to do so much construction. When you take a tour, with really good tour guides in Jerusalem, you see over and over again, like the wall, which is, the Western Wall where Jews pray, the beautiful site of what sometimes called the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the Kotel, that was not a wall of the temple itself. It was an outer wall built by Herod to surround the Temple Mount. But that's not all Herod built. He made a bunch of additions to the temple, and he built a lot of things. I mean, roads and temples, and not temples, but synagogues, all kinds of structures around Israel. He's a real big builder. Costs a lot of money. Bill is telling us he did that by playing politics with Rome, sort of one side against the other, who apparently in their own Roman civil war wanted the loyalty of their regional governors, and that's what Herod was, as I understand it, in the Holy Land. I'm in a book club, and we're reading this book on the Holocaust. It's really apropos of nothing except what you're telling me about financing projects. But I was just so I became a little emotional when I learned this statistic. The Nazis, think about how massive World War II was, right? When you think about, there's never been a war in history like World War II in terms of just numbers of soldiers in armies, millions and millions and millions of soldiers, millions of deaths, the 6 million Jews that were killed, 5 million other people just massacred by the Nazis, but also the tens of millions of soldiers who fell and the armies of so many countries that were involved to bring down Hitler and his effort. Yes, Italy and Japan were his allies. Just leave aside that theater of war, Japan versus the United States. But if you just think about Europe, right? So it was really all the countries of Europe, including the United States and Russia, against Germany, right? So Germany mobilized an extraordinary amount of resources to promote the evil of Hitler. 1/3 of all that war effort. Think about what a country spends on its military resources. Think how that number shoots up astronomically during wartime. Think how when it was Germany against all these other countries, it was just a massive, massive military effort. And 1/3 of all that military spending came from the confiscated wealth of the Jews that Hitler massacred, right? Like my relatives. And all the Jews in all those countries, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland and Romania, even the Jews of France, of Ukraine, of Western Russia, etc., all these Jews that were herded into the concentration camps, it wasn't only the despicable evil of wanting to wipe out the Jews, but it was also taking all their money, artwork, bank accounts, jewelry, all their resources to finance that war, which was used, to kill so many soldiers of other countries, all financed by the stolen wealth of the Jews. It's not surprising in any way, but I hadn't heard that statistic before, and it's kind of emotional when I learned that today. Okay, that's all that we've got for today. Let's finish on a happier note. So one thing we learned, musical instruments, prohibited on Shabbos, clapping, stomping, dancing, generally prohibited because it could lead to one using musical instruments, which could lead to repairing a musical instrument, which is definitely prohibited on Shabbos. But clapping, stomping, banging tables, etc., permitted when it's in honor of Torah. And so that's why it's certainly permitted during services in a synagogue. Apparently not by all opinions. So there's probably some congregations that don't bang and clap, but most, I would say, do. All right, so tomorrow is our Siyum with God's help, 6 p.m. Pacific, regular time. We're coming to page 105, the final Mishna, number 19 of chapter 10 here in Tractate Eruvin. We'll complete our journey through Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud, say some beautiful blessings. If you're joining us, try to have a l'chaim, a drink with you so we can make a blessing, a little bit of nash, something to eat, usually a grain product so we can make another blessing. And then we'll open our discussion, just the first few lines of the next tractate in our journey, in our 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. The next tractate is Pesachim, the laws of Pesach. We look forward to doing that together tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific, our regular time on Sundays. Have a great week, a good vach, Shavua Tov, all the best.